Some men have a vision so uncompromising that life may be likened to a jigsaw puzzle into which all pieces must be made to fit. Others are led by life's events and arrive at their destiny only by chance. Most of us neither set nor deny laws, but only recognize patterns. Thomas Harkness was an extraordinary man of the uncompromising sort. Even as a young man, when I first knew him, he was impressive, possessing great self-confidence and wit, and the ability to blind others to any view but his. For a while, he seemed to require the admiration of others, if only to rebuff it, and he had acquired something of a following, whose members he treated with little more than amused contempt. Our relationship was probably the closest he came to friendship. In time, the need to exclude from his ordered world even the possibility of a dissenting voice overcame his craving for approval, and he began to court solitude with the single-mindedness he had once applied to attracting others. He later became a writer, best known for his short stories, in which the central characters, more often than not, met tragedy by flirting with the emotional extremes of which he so strongly disapproved. Oddly, the critical acclaim that greeted his early work seemed to make him even less comfortable in the company of men, and he had taken to spending the greater part of the year on an isolated island. We kept in touch over the years with occasional meetings and infrequent correspondence, which had the flavor of postcards. But it was only through his work that I continued to really know him. I found his recent work disturbing, because although clever and beautifully crafted, his stories showed the lack of daily human contact, and his characters had become as hollow as puppets gesturing on a dimly lit stage. He'd become as predictable as one of the characters in his short stories. That is, until I read his latest work in an obscure literary magazine. This story departed from his customary style in that it was told in the first person. And though not far from his usual theme, the effect was dramatically different. It centered around a writer who, while traveling on an island ferry, was momentarily distracted by the recognition in the eyes of a young woman. At journey's end, he'd come upon her abandoned valise and turned it in with an uneasy feeling that by doing so, he had somehow established an unwanted connection with her. This premonition was confirmed when some months later, the valise unclaimed was returned to him. It contained the odds and ends that any girl might have, and he examined them with little interest, dismissing her curios and small treasures with the assurance of a man who knows himself to be an arbiter of taste. There is, however, one unusual item, a cloth-bound journal which described the owner's attempt to write a short story. She had always been drawn to older things and other people's treasures, and happily spent hours in antique stores buying old photographs, bits of jewelry engraved with the initials of strangers, and whatever appealed to her sense of whimsy.
$10.
She had come upon a battered typewriter in a second-hand store and impulsively decided to try her hand at writing. So she began a short story which focused on a writer, but soon it floundered, and frustrated, she had put it aside. months later, she saw a stranger on an island ferry. And although they didn't speak, there was something compelling in his features which isolated him from all the other passengers. She was suddenly certain that this man was the elusive central character of her abandoned story. So taken was she with this notion that she almost missed her stop, and hurrying to get off, she left her bag behind. She returned to her neglected story, and with what seemed like no effort, described a lonely island dominated by a bleak white structure. The rocks are unrelieved by tree or shrub, and the water beats a monotonous rhythm against the barren shore. This is her writer's home, and as familiar to her as if described from memory. Unconscious of the room in which she sat, she roamed inside the empty house where everywhere could be seen the trappings of a successful life. The rooms are furnished with careful taste and money, as if to impress some unseen critic. But nothing speaks of comfortable use, except perhaps the battered typewriter. Masks and artwork line the walls, but only seem to add to the impression of an exotic hotel suite whose only inhabitants have been story characters, just passing through. She feels them in this room and on this island, and is conscious of a strong desire to leave. This feeling of unease increases until she ceased to write and waited for the island to recede. She had been right to abandon this story. Her writer had no story of his own to tell. The writer closed the journal and reflected on the similarity between himself and the man she had described. For years he'd been working the same tired insights, and the resources of his own personality were indeed exhausted. Like the girl, he too stopped writing. The story ended there. But I couldn't conceive of Harkness having written it. So curious to see just what had brought about this change, I wrote to him to arrange a visit. My letter was returned to me unopened, with not so much as a forwarding address.